Hi, Bernadette. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast this morning. Same first question, of course. What's the hardest change that you've been through in your life?
Hi, well, first of all, thank you for welcoming me to your podcast. The most challenging change for me was a relocation. So when I was in my 20s, I moved to China to complete my master's degrees. And after that, I stayed in China for a total of 9 years. So I built a very good life there. I had a very good network of friends, a good career, a good job, a boyfriend, very stable situation. And then in 2009, while I was on the other side of the world, my dad got diagnosed with cancer. As the only child, it was quite challenging to be so far away from family. And it really made me question where I really wanted to be so that I could support my family better. But again, because my life was very well established there, I couldn't just, throw everything away and move back to France. It wouldn't really have made sense for me at the time. So it took me a couple of years to work out how to deal with this situation. But then eventually things in China also changed. In a few years later, my boyfriend got pneumonia because of back pollution. And we really started to question where we wanted to be. So we decided to move back to London because that's where my boyfriend is from. And so that's what we did. And I was, before we moved, I was really ready, I thought, for this change. So we prepared everything. We had it all worked out where we were going to stay in the UK. I also was very lucky because my company offered me the possibility to carry on working for them from the UK. So I thought it was all worked out. I was ready to leave, very excited. The biggest challenge for me was the reverse cultural shock of living back in the West. And I really didn't expect that. So I was ready to leave China, but I wasn't ready to deal with the new challenges in England. And by that, what I mean is living in China at the time I was there was easy for a foreigner. There wasn't many foreigners who could speak Chinese. I could speak 3 languages, so it was easy for me to find a job. And cost of living in China, I was there between 2005 and 2014. Cost of living were very reasonable. So we had a very rich social life. We were out all the time. I was lucky as well in my job to have the opportunity to travel a lot. So a very rich life, very intense. And then back in the UK, it was quite different. Obviously, any time spent outside was very expensive. I think the first time we went out for a pizza and a drink, we paid over £40, and I was thinking that that was my social budget probably for a couple of weeks in Beijing. So very quickly I realized that I wouldn't be able to have the same kind of lifestyle as what I had in China. And when I arrived in the UK, I didn't know anybody apart from my boyfriend. So I was really concerned, how am I going to build a social network? How am I going to integrate in society if I can't afford to go out and meet people? So that really actually affected my mental health because I wasn't sure suddenly if that was the right decision for me. And I started to question, where I should be. Was it a mistake to leave my comfortable life in China? Should I have gone back to France instead? But that would have been without my boyfriend because he didn't really want to do that and he can't speak French. And so, yeah, the first year for me back in London was, I think, the most challenging thing I had to deal with because I wasn't feeling well. It really affected my relationship with my boyfriend as well. it affected everything basically. So that was a very challenging thing. And, you know, you could have thought that moving from France to China was more challenging, but really it wasn't, because I moved to China as a student. I expected things to be different. I expected the challenge of the language barrier. I expected the cultural shock. What I didn't expect moving back to a country that is a neighbor to France is that I would be affected by a reverse cultural shock. I really didn't anticipate that. And yes, it took me quite a long time to feel settled in. Finally, I decided to stop working for my company that was based in China, because I was, you know, in London working from home fully remotely. And it was even more complicated to build a network and to build a social life. So I just decided to, you know, open myself to something more unknown, to see what was out there in the job market. And that's how slowly I built more confidence in the fact that it was the right choice to move back to Europe. But yes, it was a very challenging time.
Thanks for sharing that. That does sound incredibly challenging. And yes, from the outside, moving to China, particularly at a younger age when you did, on the outside, that would seem like that would be a more challenging move than moving back to Europe. But you know, perhaps that's naive of me. And I guess thinking about it, would you go back and move? Would you have stayed in China knowing what you know now, or would you still have made the move to London or back to France?
It's interesting because I turned 40 in September last year, and I didn't think I would feel old, but now just looking back, actually, I can reflect on how I felt in my early 20s when I moved to China. So China for me was the transition between my life as a student and my move to professional life. I was in China at the right time, because China at the time was preparing for the Olympics, the 2008 Olympics that were held in Beijing. So there was such a buzz going on, and such, you know, the city was full of energy and enthusiasm. And as a student who was just, you know, looking for a job, it was easy, and it was a fantastic opportunity to meet people from all over the world. I'm still friends with lots of people I met in China, and they are now based across different continents. And when I travel, I still, you know, meet them, and we keep in touch. And it was an amazing thing, an amazing experience for someone, you know, in the early 20s. So it was the right time of my life, and also the right time in China to have, you know, that experience, and it was a fantastic one. Would I have done anything differently, or would I go back now? A lot of things have changed. I'm in my 40s now, and I want a more settled life, and the UK feels like a better place to do that. In China, you can have a fantastic life living like in a bubble as a foreigner, and as much as you want to integrate into society as a foreigner, we will never be completely Chinese. You know, we will never fully be part of it. We don't have all the same cultural background, and we have a very clear place in China in the society, but it's not completely like it never felt entirely that I was, you know, going to be there forever. And I guess it was the right time for me to be there at the start of my career, because I had amazing opportunities to get access to more senior roles very quickly in my career. It was like a career fast track, because there were not many foreigners who could speak multiple languages. And it was, you know, companies were more willing to give opportunities to junior staff and to train them. It was like having apprenticeship and training at the same time as building on skills and developing your career. So that was really, really good. as time went by, also China changed, especially after the Olympics. The buzz kind of, slowly faded, and pollution arrived. And then there were a few changes in the political landscape in China that also impacted quite a lot daily life in China. So I think we came back to the UK at the right time. I'm not sure I would like to live in China for a long period of time now, but I always enjoy going back, and Beijing will always feel like home to some extent. So yeah, it just feels that it's a very nice part of my life, and I have absolutely no regret. I'm very happy about the life I have here now. It was a very exciting time as a student, a lot of unknown. And when I moved to Beijing, I didn't know anyone. I literally didn't know anyone. My French university had partnerships with different universities in China. I chose Beijing Language and Culture University because it had an amazing reputation to learn the language. I went there, and it was challenging at the beginning because naively I thought, I studied Chinese before, I will be fine, people will understand me, I will be able to, take a taxi and go grocery shopping, and actually didn't quite happen like this. People couldn't understand my pronunciation. I couldn't understand what they were saying back to me because Beijing also has a local dialect and pronunciation that I wasn't used to. And also in my class, I was with a lot of students from Japan and Korea, and for them to learn Chinese is the equivalent of, a French person learning Spanish. The languages are kind of similar in the way they are built, the alphabet, etc. So yeah, I really struggled because all these other students were picking up the language a lot faster than I was. So I really had to work very hard for the first 6 months. And then once I started to be comfortable with the language, then everything was a lot easier because at least I could communicate with people, share my thoughts, and really have meaningful conversations. So that's why I decided to stay more than 1 year. And, in the end, I stayed for 9 years. But I really needed that first year just to get comfortable with the language. And then it would have felt like a missed opportunity if I had left China after 1 year, because, it was just the time when I started to actually enjoy being there and experiencing the travel and the culture, etc. So yes, I guess it's a journey. But again, moving to China, I expected the challenge. I expected the challenge with the language. I expected that it was going to be a completely different culture. And the fact that I expected that, my expectations at the same time were prepared. I mean, I was prepared to approach this as a challenge, whereas it didn't even cross my mind when I moved back from China to the UK that I would struggle. Because for me, in my mind, it was just, I'm leaving China for a place that is close to home. I didn't think a second about how I would react to this new environment. And I guess this is why it was more challenging for me, the fact that I didn't expect this to be a challenge.
So you talk a lot about learning the language when you're there. Growing up, your mum's Portuguese and your dad's French. What language did you speak at home?
So my mum really tried to speak Portuguese to me as much as she could. My dad was never a language person, so he didn't speak Portuguese. So at home, we spoke French when we were all together, but when I was alone with my mum, she spoke Portuguese with me. And as a toddler, I was very good at speaking both languages. And then I guess once I went to school and I realized that none of my friends could speak Portuguese, I kind of lost interest in pushing that skill. And my mom was very disappointed about it, but I can understand Portuguese very well. I can't speak it fluently, but I can make myself understood. But definitely growing up in a bilingual household increased my appetite to learn more languages. So I think that made a big impact on my choice of career, my choice of studies, and my just passion for other cultures.
Well, you say that, but when we were preparing for the episode, you said that when you were 11, your aunt asked you what you wanted for Christmas, and you wanted books to learn Chinese. And that moment, even at 11 years old, feels like it's had a defining impact on your life and career. Where did that come from?
Yes, to be honest, I don't know actually, because we didn't have any Chinese people living in my area. There was absolutely no Chinese influence around me. There was nothing such as, maybe a TV show or a film that would have had a strong impact on me. Nothing like that. So I really can't explain. I really cannot explain why I was really wanting to learn Chinese. Even to this day, I really can't explain why. It's just something that was on the back of my mind. And so my aunt bought me a few books about Chinese characters and the Chinese French dictionary, and I got really into it. I started to learn on my own, which was very, very difficult, but I was really resilient. I really wanted to make it work. And my parents, I guess, were a bit concerned that if I made it my choice of, higher education, that it would just be a phase and that I would give up. So in high school, where I was, I didn't have a lot of options with my second language. So I had the choice between Spanish and German, and I chose German. So when I started university and I told my parents I really want to learn Chinese, my dad said, okay, you can learn Chinese, but you have to keep your German. And I wasn't super excited about it because I was good at German, but I knew it was not, an area I was going to explore later in my life. But they're fine, I agreed. So I studied a total of 7 years of German, and I'm very ashamed actually to say that. I don't even put it on my resume anymore, I think. But yes, it wasn't a phase. Chinese wasn't a phase. When I started in Lyon in 2001, I think we were more than 50, close to 60 people in my class. At the end, when I finished my master's degree, I think it was less than 10 of us that were in that original cohort that were still there. So I think there is a lot of that. Chinese creates a lot of enthusiasm because it's new, and Chinese culture looks really exciting, but it's hard work to learn the language and to persevere and to reach a certain level. So yes, quite a few people just gave up on the way.
And you ended up studying Chinese in Preston, which which I don't know why I'm surprised about, but it did surprise me.
Yeah, so again, well, that was quite an interesting one because my French university again had several partnerships in the UK, and it was part of this Erasmus program. So I was 19 when I applied for an Erasmus year abroad, and my options in the UK were a couple of small towns, including Preston, which I had I had never heard of before. But actually, yes, it was a small town. And in my mind, again, being 19, my idea of the UK was based on what I knew of London. So to arrive in Preston was, quite a shock for the first few weeks. But actually, the language department of UCLan University was really good. And what is even more impressive is that my Chinese teacher, when I was in Preston, was called Linda, and I wasn't sure where she was from in China. So she was my teacher in 2003 for a year, and then I went back to France, completely lost touch with Linda. And when I arrived in Beijing in September 2005, on my first day at university, who did I bump into? Linda. And she was my teacher in Beijing for another year.
Wow.
So that was, in China, they have a word called yuanfen. to describe something that was meant to happen, you know, something that was like destiny or yeah, so I do believe in that. It was just amazing, me not knowing anyone in China. And the first day I walk on that campus, I see this teacher who was my teacher a few years ago in the UK.
And ironically, with what you do now, you said your worst memories were the accommodation.
Yes. Yes, I guess back in 2003, when I arrived in Preston, PBSA, so student accommodation, was still in some kind of early days in terms of student services. The facilities were okay, like the rooms, everything was okay. I was actually in a brand new accommodation, very close to the campus. But I guess at the time, the way they were matching flatmates was not very sophisticated. I was a third-year international student, and my flatmates were first-year UK students. And I didn't really have a good time because of that. They were at a different stage of their student life. They wanted to party. I just wanted a much quieter environment to focus on my studies. So I guess that was part of the reason I didn't enjoy it so much. So now that I am working in this industry, I completely understand why students have sometimes very specific requirements about who they want to live with. And I completely relate to, you know, to the kind of experience they are looking for, depending on where they come from or depending on their year of studies. And if you think about it, you know, as a student, when you're not on campus, you are in your accommodation. So it's really the place where students spend the most of their time while they are overseas, especially. So it's extremely important that their experience is right, that the level of customer service is right. And I think this is where, you know, I was disappointed because, again, my room was fine. But when there was an issue, there was no one to speak to. There was no staff to help or to address any issues that we had with flatmates. And the sector has evolved so much. When I see what we do now to support students with, you know, flatmate issues or with all kind of, you know, welfare issues, that didn't exist back then. So yeah, it's just very positive to see all the changes. I kind of wish it was already there at the time I was a student.
So going back to when you moved to China, so it was 2005, you were 21, you didn't know anyone, as you said, and there weren't a lot of foreigners that spoke Chinese. So talk to me about that arrival and what that looks like, because, you know, we'll go on to talk a little bit about international students and moving to other countries, and your experience clearly helps you in your role to guide and provide guidance around that. But I'm really interested to know what that was like arriving in Beijing, a huge city you'd never been to before. What was it like?
Okay, so I studied Chinese for a few years when I was in France before going to China. And I think one thing that my university did right is to introduce some Chinese students who were at that French university. And I was introduced to a Chinese girl that I'm still in contact with, and she was from Beijing. I told her I was moving to Beijing in a next couple of months, and she said, "Well, my parents can help you find a flat, and they will visit that flat to make sure it's not a scam. And if we need to pay a deposit or anything, they will make sure that it's all done in the right way." And she helps me a lot. So I will be forever grateful for all the weight she took off my shoulders just by helping me to find a flat before I even arrived there. So I was extremely lucky to have her. And then when I arrived in Beijing, so I had the address, etc., I went to that flat. I met with my friend's uncle, and that was a bit difficult because he couldn't speak English. I could barely speak any Chinese. And so anyway, we kind of understood each other. I understood what he paid for the deposit. I paid him back. He had checked everything with the landlord. So that was all sorted for me. And they also helped me with little things, but actually, as a student, it's big thing, you know, things like how to open a bank account when you don't understand the language and you are also worried you're going to do the wrong thing or sign the wrong paperwork. So I was very, very lucky in that sense to have someone to help me with these first steps. But then when I was at university, very quickly, I mean, I'm quite an extrovert, so I go towards people easily to start a conversation. And we were students coming from all over the world, from, you know, Czech Republic, Japan, Korea, other European countries, from the US. There were people literally from everywhere. And we were all on our own, you know, very few people actually knew anybody. And when you are in that situation, you build friendships a lot quicker because you don't want to be lonely, you don't want to be on your own. So we started to get to know each other actually a lot faster than we would have in any other kind of context, and also to help each other and support each other. And when you're young as well, you probably do that. It's a lot easier to do that than once you are an adult and you're already a lot more settled in your ways and you have your life. As a student, it was I felt quite easy to build this relationship in this kind of environment because none of us knew anyone. And when you are learning a language, we had a lot of classes anyway where we had to build dialogues, we had to do a lot of work activities, and that also helped a lot to build these relationships. This multicultural environment for me was magical. To have the opportunity to learn about, you know, people coming from Kazakhstan, from Uzbekistan. We even had a couple of, well, 4 or 5 classmates from North Korea, South Korea. It was so international. It was the most amazing experience. Yeah.
So then when you finished studying, you ended up taking a job in the building industry, which seems a bit of a different move.
Yeah, so there was a website called the Beijinger for people to post ads about a bit of everything. And it was quite common for students just about to graduate to, you know, look for a job and just post something about their skills and what they wanted. And again, at the time, I was lucky because there wasn't a lot of foreigners. So as soon as I posted something, a few companies contacted me for interviews. And I was contacted by this company, kind of Hong Kong company, but set up by a few French speaking people. And then they just needed someone who could speak multiple languages and also who was willing to travel and to learn about project management and helping them to source reliable suppliers, negotiate contracts, and be the bridge between, you know, overseas customers and the local manufacturers. It was a steep learning curve, but the most rewarding thing at the same time, because I've learned so much. I had to manage a team of Chinese people as well, which was a bit intimidating because I was very young. I was 24. I had to travel on my own to visit very remote places in China, very rural industrial places, not really the kind of tourist spot that you would expect. And it was, again, a very intense and rewarding experience. I've learned a lot very quickly. I had to. The challenge, I guess, for a young white woman working in this industry is that China is very much based on a Confucius society, which means people give respect to elderly people, to people who are older than them, and to men, probably more than to women. So it was difficult for me to find my place. as someone in a management position, having to give instruction to men who were much older than me, and then to have to work with them to achieve, what we had to deliver, and to sometimes, having to ask them to put things right when there were issues. So it was difficult to get their respect and to get their trust. But, me talking the language helped a lot, because they could see that I was, genuinely interested in communicating, and also, just willing to work with them instead of just, going there, giving them instructions and then rush back. I was genuinely building relationships with them, and building that trust in China is so important. And I guess it would be a lot more difficult for someone who couldn't speak the language and who couldn't understand the culture to have done this job, because it was not only about the transactional elements of, signing a contract and delivering a product. We were working on very high value projects, and it was all about building a relationship with a supplier that was going to be a partner for us for, in some cases, a couple of years. So I really enjoyed doing that. I didn't get it completely right at the first time, because I wasn't quite sure even myself how to deal with it. But I just learned from my mistakes, and tried to be as humble as possible, to make sure they would, I would earn their respect in that way.
So then you talked towards the beginning of our conversation today about the build up to the 2008 Olympics in Beijing, and what that was like, and how different a time it was. So talk to me about that period.
So Beijing was getting ready for the biggest event they had the biggest international event they had put together since China fully reopened, at the early of the year 2000. So it was a massive challenge for the country. And the Olympics is really what put China back on the international scene, I suppose, because everybody was blown away by their opening ceremony. But it was a long journey for them to get there, and they wanted to get it absolutely right. So they built the entire Olympic village, which was a small village with small houses. So they had to relocate a lot of people, and that was not always done in the best way, let's say. They could have, probably done it a bit better, but they did it. They just cracked on with it, built that Olympic village, built a lot of infrastructures. I remember they even provided tapes to all the taxi drivers with English lessons for them to be able to communicate with tourists. So it was quite funny, because every time we took a taxi between 2006 and 2008, the taxi drivers would practice their English with us, and play the tape to us and ask us if they were saying things right. And so that was actually a really good thing to be part of. But, more in the thing that I found the most amazing is the pace at which the country changed. So just to give you an example, when I arrived in China in 2005, in Beijing, there were only 3 underground lines, and they were pretty old. And since then, they have pretty much opened 1 or 2 new lines every year. So now there are 23 subway lines in Beijing, with a network of 700 kilometers, which makes Beijing the city with the largest underground network in the world. To give you a comparison, it's about 400 kilometers of subway lines in London, and a similar number in New York. So the pace of change in Beijing, especially just the years building up towards the Olympic, it was amazing. Everything had to be built, from infrastructures to training people, making the city ready for the games. The buzz that was there was amazing. I had never experienced anything like this before, in terms of that energy, and every day something new was changing. Every day a new building was starting to be built, or something new was happening. And then again, moving back to the UK, things feels a lot more, settled and slow in that sense, because we've got all the infrastructures here already. The UK has been a developed country for a long time, so things don't change that fast. But in China went from being quite, in development country at the early of the year 2000 to becoming the second largest economy in the world. And that happened in less than 10 years. So that's a very impressive growth. And to be there at that time was just, surreal to see how quickly things were changing and how quickly they were embracing new technology, embracing, the digital age. AI is just not something that we have been able to do in Europe to some extent. It still feels like we are playing catch up with some of the technology that is being used in China now.
And I guess thinking back to the London Olympics 2012, obviously there was on a smaller scale, but build up to that and all that sort of happened. And then as soon as the games happened, it was, oh, okay, that's done now.
Yeah.
What do we do with all this new infrastructure, all these things that we built, such a huge event? And I imagine that was the same in Beijing and the country as a whole. It was, once that event was over, there'd been such a huge build up. What happened next?
So yes, two things. I think, as you said, the build up was so intense. They wanted to get it absolutely right. They didn't want the international press to be able to report in anything negative about China. So they just made sure that everything was perfect, that all the hotels that were hosting the athletes and the journalists were immaculate, that all the staff was fully trained on customer service, and they got it absolutely right. They even made sure that all the coal powered factories around Beijing were closed so that the pollution was gone and it was blue sky every day. They took care of every single details to make the city clean and welcoming, and to make sure that everybody was going to have a good time. And it worked like a dream. And as you said, as soon as the Olympics finished, well, all the coal-powered factories reopened. And once all the foreign press was gone, it really felt like things were more back to the way it was before this build-up for the Olympics. But at the same time, the Olympics really brought China on the international scene. And the buzz carried on way after the Olympics, because I think a lot of people were still considering China as, the chip manufacturer of the world. And with this Olympic ceremony, at least China could demonstrate that they were aiming at something much bigger. And they could demonstrate that they now had the skills, the infrastructures to do a lot more than just that. So I think it also attracted a lot of interest from many international businesses and journalists, and just a curiosity about how fast China had transformed itself. So I would say, yes, there was definitely that effect of, something that a souffle that you put in the oven and it all grows. And as soon as you take it out of the oven, it all becomes flat again. There was definitely that effect. But I guess the other thing was really the long-term buzz that Beijing and China enjoyed after these Olympics, because it was such a game changer for China.
And then post sort of 2008, the next few years, as we talked again at the start of the conversation, but you had a huge amount of change going on in those next few years, particularly with your father being diagnosed with cancer and ultimately passing away in 2010. That must have been really tough being in China so far away.
it was really tough, and the fact that I'm an only child was also another challenge. My mom, as I said, is from Portugal. She moved to France in the 70s, but all her family is still in Portugal. So she was also on her own in France to deal with this. So I was very fortunate at the time that the company I was working for had a lot of customers in France. And so my company let me spend enough time in France so that I could support my mother, but at the same time continue to work and attend events in France and visit customers. So I was very lucky to be able to make it work that way. I guess in that sense, my family is very close to the format of a Chinese family, you know, where you have the only child who a lot of people think that being an only child is a blessing because you get everything to yourself. And maybe there is a little bit of that, I don't know. But at the same time, as you grow up as an only child, you feel more pressure and you can't share that pressure with anyone. So I didn't have any siblings close to my mother that I could really ask for help or just ask to check on her or do little things, you know, like helping with some paperwork or take some weight off her shoulders with, you know, house cleaning or little things like this. I didn't have anyone. And that was really hard because every day in China, part of me was, you know, I enjoying myself being there, but that family situation was, of course, always in the back of my mind. And I felt very guilty for being in China and for enjoying myself and for leaving my mom on her own. So I spent a lot of time questioning if, you know, what I should do. I didn't feel that it was also fair for me to ask my boyfriend to move out of China if he didn't want to. So I was thinking, you know, should I just leave everything behind, move back to France, see it through there, and then see what happens? Or, you know, so many different scenarios went through my mind about where I should be, how I should be handling the situation. And in some cases, you know, you've got good friends who are trying to support you, and you also have people who can be quite hurtful with their comments, whether it's on purpose or not. But, you know, with sentences like, so obviously you're going to move back to France now, right? Or things like this made me feel even more guilty with people assuming that as the child, you know, I didn't have any other options but just to give up everything. And I guess maybe it's quite I don't know if it's a French mentality or if it's just the fact that my mom lives in quite a rural area and that's more the way of thinking back there. But every time I went back, I felt this massive weight in my conscience and massive guilt every time I had to go back to China. So yes, having to deal with this, you know, personal experience, my dad being ill was already very traumatic. And having to deal, I felt a social pressure. I really felt that there was a kind of social pressure from people around my mom. And that really didn't make me feel comfortable. And it really added to my questioning of, you know, where I should be and what I should do. So it was very unsettling. And I completely relate now, again, being in the industry that I'm in today, when we have international students coming to the UK, and even if they are coming sometimes, you know, for a year or it's quite a short period of time, but if anything happens back home, you know, especially if they are the only child, the impact it can have on their daily life is huge. And yes, for me, it just, and I was very young as well. So it was a lot to take in. And at that age, I guess it was the first big challenge I had to deal with. So I also didn't have that life experience that maybe we get later in life, which make us more rational with the way we approach change. and with the way we just approach life events, you know. So being so young, and life inexperienced, if we can call it that way, it just made it very difficult for me to know what to do. And yeah, luckily enough, I mean, I saw it through, but this is the kind of change that took several years. You know, sometimes your life, you go into a life change, and that's quite a quick change. But sometimes actually there are many things that lead to a change, and you have to prepare for that change the best you can. And you don't even know what the outcome of that change is going to be. You just know that the current situation is not right. So I guess this is what I was trying to work out. What was the best for myself? What was the best for me to support my mother? But at the same time, yes, to make sure that it was the right thing to do for me, and that I would not just regret and then become bitter about the fact that I had just made a very emotional decision, and potentially, you know, maybe I would have regretted it, a sudden change in the future. So it was really hard at such a young age to know what to do.
So you did decide to leave China. Talk to me about that period and what led to you ultimately making that decision.
Yes, so with my boyfriend, I mean, I was ready to leave at around, I think, 2012. And the build-up with this pollution, to be honest, that started to be a bit scary. So I think from 2012 to 2014, the pollution in Beijing was really bad. So we all had an app on our phone that it's an app built, I believe, by the American embassy that gives a pollution rating. And anything below 50 is healthy. And then you've got 50 to 100, which is slightly unhealthy, 200 to 500, that is really hazardous. And Beijing at the time was reaching 999 on a weekly basis. Like there was at least 1 or 2 days in the week. The app didn't even have a rating that could go beyond 1,000, but I'm sure if it did, the number would have been worse. And even the American embassy didn't have a name for that level of pollution. So they ended up calling crazy bad. And so having to deal with this every day was really affecting, you know, our daily life, because based on the reading, the app would tell you if you could go out, if you could exercise. And it was really impacting what we could do, but just also, yeah, it was really having a bad effect on health, on my skin, on everything. And I just thought, you know, that was the additional little thing that added to the fact I wanted to leave. But my boyfriend didn't really want to leave at that time. He was still not ready. He was considering it, but he was not ready. And I think it took him another 12 months to get to the idea that it would be a better option for us not to be there. But that last year for me was, I didn't enjoy it that much, because in my mind, I knew that I didn't really want to be there, and the pollution didn't help. And also I saw quite a few friends leaving China at the time. So that didn't help either. But that's the thing when you are a foreigner living in a foreign country, and you have, you know, friends from all over the world, comes a point where everybody parts their way and goes to different places. So yes, I was ready, I think, to go by 2012, but at least I took 1 year to really shape a project and to think really properly about where I wanted to go, what I wanted to be. And yeah, it ended up working quite well. In January 2014, we moved to London. I was very lucky again that my company offered me to continue to work for them. But it was a long build up. It was really not a sudden change for me, I would say. And maybe it was for the best, I don't know, because sometimes it's also good not to do something, you know, in an impulsive way, and to properly think about it.
And you said in the build up to this episode that when you were sort of had China burnout, you wanted a job that had nothing to do with China. Yet, you know, on the whole, you've talked about the experience being there for such a long time as being really positive, and I wondered what that felt like and how you came to feel like that you were just you wanted a break from everything related to China when you came to London.
Yes, very true. And I think if I had left China by 2012, like I wanted to, maybe I wouldn't have felt that burnout. But living in China is very intense. When you work in a Chinese business, I don't know if you know about the 996 culture, but it's a term that is quite common in China to refer to people who work from 9 to 9, 6 days a week. And so even if it's not, official, it would never be written on a contract, but that's pretty much how it works. There is no boundaries between private and personal life. You can sometimes work over weekends. It's quite common to receive work emails in the evening and just to get, to sink into it and to have to reply right away. So it's really, it can be a bit overwhelming, especially in the long term. And I was working in quite a fast-paced environment with quite stressful, high-value projects as well. So it felt like a lot of responsibilities. And when you do that for years, I guess after a while, it just becomes very intense to be sustainable. But between 2012 and 2014, I just started to feel very negative about everything and just, I guess, unhappy about being so far away from home and to have to work so hard. And I guess it just became what was a very positive thing started to become a vicious circle where, every negative little thing that was adding to the way I already felt became a much bigger thing for me to deal with. And so I started to just be very negative about this amount of stress and work and pollution. And I just couldn't see any more positivity about the life I had then. And so that's why I really felt it was time for a change. And I took the option to accept, when my company offered to continue to work for them for a year, because I thought, I'm moving to the UK. I don't know anyone. I don't have any network that I can tap into to ask for help to find a job. I didn't know what the job market would be like in the UK or how my experience and my skills would translate in this new country. So I thought it would be a good thing to have at least a job, to start with. But after that, I realized, playing with the time difference and having to deal with this kind of work remotely it was just too stressful. And again, I really wanted to start building a social network and meet people. But yes, that's when I decided, I probably need a break from China right now, because it felt that I had dedicated a lot of my early career years with spending much more than 8 or 9 hours per day working. And I just felt that maybe if I work in a different industry, it would be a bit different. But yeah, it didn't last for very long, because eventually after a year, I started to miss it like crazy. And I was very happy when Unite approached me and talked about, Chinese market and international markets.
So yes, come on to your current role with Unite students, and so talk to me about what you do now for them.
So I joined Unite in 2016, and it was shortly after Unite opened an office in China, and they just needed someone to focus more on the international markets and to help build the traction with developing brand awareness with these international markets, understand the potential, help with ways of working, support the China team from the UK and all of that. So I guess my first year was more about finishing that setup and making sure that the UK understood how China worked and that the China side had the right support from the UK. And there are some challenges maybe that on the UK side they didn't even anticipate, such as the Great Firewall of China, which makes it very difficult for a lot of websites and network that are not based in China just to be accessible. And so we had a lot of IT challenges to solve when we started. But little things like that, it was just good to have me on board for the business to understand how to get around some of these challenges. So yes, year one was more about that setup, and then it was all about growing the partnerships with our partners overseas, starting with China and then expanding to other markets and learning from our experience with the partnerships in China to kind of replicate that with other markets. So I went from being on my own to now having a team of 15 people, and we've been supporting international partners, international students with their needs of accommodation and supporting them before they arrive in the UK, which is the most important, is just making sure that they have the right level of information and the confidence that they're making the right choice about their accommodation before they arrive in the UK. So that's what we've been building over the years.
So I read a couple of things that you created a cultural awareness workshop for China, for the teams here. And also, I read your post on LinkedIn about people proclaiming themselves to be China experts. And I don't know if I've got a question about it, but it did make me think about the time that I was working in student accommodation, when obviously dealing with Chinese students that had just come to the UK on a daily basis, and thinking, we tried our best to make them feel comfortable. But given everything we've talked about the sort of cultural differences and everything else, what are the major things that sort of student accommodation teams can do to help, well, any international students, but perhaps Chinese students, settle in the UK if it's their first time being here?
I think that's yes, there would be a lot to say about that. But when I joined Unite, I mean, it was quite a new industry for me as well. But I guess I just had a lot of transferable skills that that were useful for Unite. So we have accommodation in 23 different cities, and as part of my induction, I just traveled across the UK to visit our site teams in different cities. And in some cities, we have properties aligned with universities that attract a lot of Chinese students. So in some cases, we can have up to like 80% of Chinese students in some buildings. And even when it's not that much, it's just site teams had a lot of questions about, issues that they had, like complaints that started to be very small, but then escalated beyond what they expected, or just to understand how to manage expectations with Chinese customers when something goes wrong, or about communication style. And we had, after having these discussions with the site teams, I thought, well, I could actually put together a presentation or something that could be useful. And that presentation turned into a workshop, an engaging workshop that I delivered to our site teams, just to help them understand, we talked about, for example, family pressure, and the fact that most of the Chinese students, living with us, they are the only child. And the pressure that they have is way beyond the pressure I have as a French only child, because they have all these expectations from, several generations above them, grandparents and parents who have saved all their money to make sure that this only kid has the best education, has the best life, and has everything that they couldn't have when they grew up. But that also means that once that student graduates, there is this expectation that he would land on a high-paid, amazing job so that he can look after his family. And all that, maybe doesn't come naturally to everybody's mind, because when you think about a UK 18 years old who just arrived at university, they are pretty, carefree. They just want to party, they want to drink, they want to have fun. It's their first time away from mom and dad, and they are really not in the same mindset as that international student who, or Chinese student more specifically, who has all this family pressure and they just want to focus on their studies and they just want to be successful. And maybe sometimes Chinese students feel a bit misunderstood because of that. And so I just wanted to make sure that we understood our customers and that we understood what was in the back of their mind when they were asking some specific questions, and how to read beyond the words, basically. And also when a customer was complaining, sometimes it felt to our teams that some of the customers came across as rude. And I guess it's because, you know, when you translate word for word from Chinese to English, some things can sound rude because the Chinese language tends to be a lot more direct. So it was just more about giving our site teams some tips and just the assurance that they understood the customer's background a bit better, so that they could reply to them in a more bespoke, like customized way, instead of just taking a blanket communication approach with students, you know, from all over the world. So yes, I think that was, you know, it can sound like little things, but just, you know, how to communicate with a customer, or how, you know, not to take it personally if they say this instead of that, or you know, if something goes wrong in a building, what can we do differently to make sure that the customer understand what we are doing about it, so that they don't feel that frustration so much. So yeah, all these elements I thought I could really help with, and I think it's been really well welcomed, and we still do it, this cultural awareness, and yes, I think it does make a difference.
I definitely could have used that a few years ago. We've gone on to the quick fire round questions now. So if you could change one thing about the world, what would it be?
Well, I think pollution affected me so much when I was in Beijing, and this is probably what triggered the most negativity in me. So anything that is linked to the environment is quite close to my heart, and everything about, you know, big businesses making statements, you know, about, like, when you go in a supermarket and you see all this plastic packaging and all this waste, and you hear supermarkets talking about their 2050 targets. And I'm just, you know, part of me really thinks that the world is doing too little and too slow. So if there is one thing I could change, is just, you know, help people understand and open their eyes about things that, you know, we need to act now. We can't just wait another 50 years to do something about pollution. And yes, I mean, yes, everything about the environment and just transparency that businesses have about that is something I feel quite strongly about.
Okay. And what advice would you give to someone who wants to change direction but doesn't know where to start?
Well, I'm not sure if I'm very good at giving advice, but what I would say is I can be, with maybe it's my Latin background, but I can be quite impulsive. And one thing that life taught me is not to make any changes based on an emotional reaction. So just make sure before you change anything in your life that you are changing it for the right reason, that you've kind of thought it through. You don't need to have a perfect plan, because it's never going to be perfect. If you want to change something, you should never wait to have something that ticks all your boxes. It's never going to happen. But so it's important to have a plan. It's also important not to overthink it, but it's really important to have really thought about the consequences and to have, you know, considered all the pros and cons of changing something. That can be quite life-changing. So yeah, I would say just be prepared. Don't be a perfectionist, but make sure that you are prepared.
Okay. And what's going to be your next big change?
I wish there was one. I guess I'm at a stage now where I just want to continue to learn and improve and validate my skills. So what I have in mind is more about maybe starting a degree, or something about, you know, international relation or international business, things that I've always been passionate about. I wish I had a big change, like, I'm going to move to another amazing destination after 9 years in China and 10 years in the UK. But no, I'm quite happy where I am now, actually. So I'm not looking for a big change, but I will definitely continue to work on making sure that my life is not dull, and that I always look for something new to keep myself, excited.
And last question, if you were to recommend a guest for me to speak to on Know Your Shift, who would it be?
So working in this industry, I came across some people with amazing, personal experience and work experience. And I would recommend you speak to someone called Vicky Zhang. So Vicky is part of a company called uHomes, and they are probably the largest student accommodation platform in China. And Vicky has lived in the UK for years, and she has a very interesting personal story. She's raising her family here in the UK across two cultures, between China and British culture. She is passionate about what she does in the student accommodation sector, and I'm sure she would have a lot of interesting things to say to you.
Thanks. Yeah, we'll definitely reach out to her and try and get a recording booked in. Bernadette, thanks so much for joining me today. I've learned so much about so many different things, particularly about your experience in China, and how that experience helps students here in the UK. And the theme of this podcast is change, and you've certainly someone that's experienced a huge amount of change, both positive and some challenging ones. And I think we'd all do well to listen and learn from some of the changes you've been through. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much for having me today.